Okay, we are on the downhill to the end of the conference. I think it's always very useful just to get the views of some of our ethics committee chair people, because I think we hear a lot of talks from either members or from researchers, but we don't often hear from the chairs themselves. So I do have a reasonably esteemed panel, and hopefully they're all there. I can see Mandy's there, Michael's there, and Hudson's joining us as well, as is Susie Ferry, and of course Andrew Crowden. So now the best way to do this, I guess, is get everyone on screen at once, so you can adjust your own screens and try and get everyone there. So this is really a question and answer session, hopefully to provoke some discussion, but I would also welcome some questions for those who wish to from the audience. So let me introduce from left to right on my screen, Associate Professor Susie Ferry, Chair of the Royal Prince Alfred Ethics Committee. It's a bit like Celebrity Squares, if anyone remembers that from the 70s and 80s. Dr. Hudson Burden, from the Chair of the Townsville Hospital and Health Service, HREC. Professor Andrew Crowden, the Professorial Fellow at Uni of Melbourne, Chair of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, HREC. Associate Professor Mandy Downing, Co-Chair of the IATSIS HREC, and Mandy, I can't remember if you chair also Curtin University, but you know, okay. Very good, IATSIS. And we heard from Michael the other day, the esteemed Professor Michael Martin, statistician, old white bloke by his own admission, and also member of the Australian Health Ethics Committee. So let us not tarry. So look, I'll just pose some questions, and I guess we discuss them to see where we get to. So given we've heard quite a lot about different subjects here, and the professionalization of ethics committees, or the whether lay people are still lay people, what do we think about whether or not ethics committees in this time of new technologies needs, under the national statement, a refresh to reconsider categories? So Susie, you're the first on the screen, so we'll just start with you there. Do we need a refresh of member categories in the national statement to take into account, I guess, all of the technologies, artificial intelligence, changes to legislation, the need for involvement of community engagement, etc. Maybe put it in the context of your own ethics committee as well. Oh, can't actually hear you, Susie. Don't know why. Oh, okay, Susie, hang fire. Let me then just go to Andrew Crowden to start with then. Andrew.
Okay, so of course the categories have recently been refreshed in relation to the gender. Instead of layman, laywoman, that category has changed. There have been arguments over the years to include someone with a philosophical, ethical background. There is someone of that nature on HREC, but it's never been put forward through the HREC system. I think I would support it, but others probably wouldn't, so that'd be an interesting debate. The categories, I think, as they are, work very well, and I think in some ways they work better than animal ethics committees, where there are only 4 categories. The variety of categories on a human research ethics committee is good because it brings a diverse experience. The other area, as well as the philosopher, ethicist type person that has been argued over the years, is a consumer from the sort of research area that where the research is being undertaken. And I think that's a pretty powerful, there are good arguments for that as well. So I'm open to having that discussion. I think it's an interesting one, Gordon.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I noticed the other day in the chat when I was expounding my view of the fact that HRECs, are more experiential. I noticed your comment about the requirement for philosophy. So it's a pretty reasonable argument. Susie,
ethics committees do, I believe this strongly. They are experiential, as you say, bringing in diversity experience, but it is also one place in the world where you can engage in philosophical discourse that has real practical outcome and people need to follow the eventual decision. And I think that's a philosophical reflection. And I think the traditional, however we see ethics, is brought to bear on the debate, the discussion, and the eventual outcome. So I think it is philosophy. I think it's applied philosophy of its very best. It's philosophy in the community of researchers, participants, and members of committees. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. It's a great answer. Susie, how's your acoustics now?
I think. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, it's the New South Wales Health block against Zoom. New South Wales Health doesn't trust Zoom, so whenever we are forced by someone interstate to do anything on Zoom, we have to do workarounds. So apologies for that. I think our ethics committee doesn't have the same rigid idea about the categories that a lot of other committees that I've heard of seem to. We have to meet the requirements for a quorum, but we don't, when we're talking in the meetings, we don't distinguish between different kinds of members. And I'm inclined to feel like because there's so much overlap, having a rigid idea of like you're just a layperson kind of ignores the knowledge and the experience that person has in other areas than just representing like some kind of bland community person. And similarly, all of the clinicians are people who live in the community and have lived experience of various other life things.
I think it's a great point, Susie. And just to jump in, I mean, everyone has their own lived experience, and having category B members who are meant to be lay people, but ultimately I guess they are de facto lived experience people, and I sometimes wonder if you really have to bring all of the lived experience on the committee to bear in any particular situation to get a better perspective.
Yeah, and some of my colleagues in my department who have various backgrounds from other countries and other cultures, I think feel like aiming for diversity with rigid categories can just end up with a sort of box ticking rather than aiming for true diversity where you're not kind of making somebody stand for a whole group of people as the sole representative of that group. I think there's a danger if you make more categories or make them really rigid that you end up, one person is the Indigenous person and they're supposed to be representing all of Indigenous people. It kind of negates.
Well, that's a different discussion about.
Yeah, or a disabled person or a lived experience person that just they're supposedly representing the whole diversity of that category of person where you can't. One person can't do that. So
I think that's it's a wonderful segue to Mandy. Mandy, if you want to pop on your microphone and let's talk about the IATSIS committee and in what you've just heard. I mean, I know you and I have discussed, and I think we've even heard a talk today about tokenism. How is your committee structured? Is it fit for purpose, appropriate? Do you think it needs more members? And what do you think about potential tokenism?
Well, as the token Aboriginal person on this panel,
Andrew has a lot of Aboriginal interest. It was Andrew that wanted some questions about Aboriginal Indigenous research, and I do have some. So please don't feel that you are alone. We're with you in spirit.
No, so Andrew is an exec member on our IATSIS committee who does assist myself and Trent Shepherd, who's the other co-chair. The way our committee is structured is, I think we're majority membership is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I guess it is a little bit different to, say, a university committee. So I'm on UWA's Human Research Ethics Committee as a committee member, and I am very much the token there. But it's a very different dynamic in having 2/3 membership of all Indigenous people around the table. Be interesting to hear Andrew's reflections on what that's like. I think we all enjoy it, but I mean, for us, we're a national committee, so we need that perspective of people from across the country. And, you know, if we're advocating for Indigenous voice, you can't do that without that Indigenous standpoint. I know the Aboriginal Health Ethics Committees operate in a similar vein around the country in that they do have majority Indigenous membership, but I won't speak for them. I think the tokenistic conversation is worthwhile having because by way of your initial question around what categories do we, you know, are we happy with what we've got now? Is there more change needed? We still haven't seen a change in the national statement under section 5.1.30 in the requirement to have an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person on any of the mainstream committees. That has not changed. And I do wonder what the burden is going to look like now on those Indigenous people within our institutions with research that might go in the direction of other pathways, so those lower risk reviews, and what then happens to our Indigenous colleagues. Are we ever going to have time to actually focus on our own research, or will we be forever reviewing everyone else's and making everyone else's research career? So I think there's a number of different questions there, and I think since at least 2016, I've been posing the question of why is there no mandatory requirement to have an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person on our HRECs in this country?
Yeah, and of course, Hayley Germain from Charles Darwin Uni, they've approached it differently, and and I really love that representation from the Central Australia Conference. So you don't just get someone from, you know, from Turrbal and Yagara, you have people from many different areas, which I think if we think of projects that take place on a national basis, you really need that representation, do you not? Yeah. Okay, let me throw to Hudson then. Hudson, let me just give you a bit of a flavour of different things. So we talk about, as Mandy suggested, we've talked a lot about Indigenous research, not necessarily in this talk right now, but in the conference. But, you know, there are many studies that come our way that are not just about Indigenous research. There are other ethnic groups involved. Are we structured appropriately to deal with them?
I think the general answer is yes. I have confidence in my committee, which has two rosters. So really we have two committees, that they feel competent in engaging with the issues that come before us with the various applications we've received. And when we don't, we do have people to call on. We do bring in experts. There's a whole First Nations health unit in the hospital, which we draw on. We've got a subcommittee set up for the psychedelic things. The difficulty we have, like everybody else has, is in a legal representative. And the expertise in which we have felt that we desperately needed to bring into the committee and did is data management, taking into account large language models, artificial intelligence, as well as data security and data privacy. And we have a robust unit of that sort in the hospital as well. So we've had the director of that unit become a member. And that's fixed or plugged a hole that we felt that we had.
Hudson, thanks so much for that. And a wonderful segue to the inestimable Michael Martin and his penchant, indeed, Michael, if you're still there, hopefully you are, your penchant for AI, statistics and data management. And just listening to what Hudson says, does what Hudson's proposing potentially mean that, you know, we actually have more specialized ethics committees that are, you know, well constituted for certain things but not for others?
Look, it's a great question. I'm going to correct one thing you said there, Gordon. As a statistician, I am estimable for sure. So
lies and statistics, Michael.
Well, I'll try not to do the first two. But look, I'm going to make a pitch and then I'm going to make a statement around breadth. So the pitch is this. I think around 10 years ago, the late Sue Wilson, a famous Australian statistician, and I made a submission through the Statistical Society of Australia to NHMRC to have a statistician be a mandatory part of every ethics committee. And this came from what I noted in my own ethics committee, where so many of the questions that came up had a statistical element. And that's not to say that the numbers drive everything, but because we're looking at human behaviour and aspects of humans, there's doubtless a statistical element that infects it all. Yeah, and this has come into sharp relief even more now, because the impact of AI has thrust statistical models that many people don't understand, including many statisticians. Now, we understand the mechanics of them, but we don't necessarily understand why they do what they do, right? And so we've got this black box that's suddenly been thrust among us, the AI black box. And this leads to biases of many different kinds. And if you can't get a handle on the bias, your research can head off in the wrong direction inexorably, and you can't recover. And if you don't know that that's a risk going in, guess what? When you fall into the trap, you're probably not going to be able to work out first that you are in the trap, or second, how to get out of the damn thing. And so having a statistician as part of an advisory group to assist researchers, navigate this black box problem is, I think, really, really important. Now, I'll follow up with a second comment about breadth. I don't think that specialised HRECs are the way to go. I think the strength of HRECs lies in the diversity of the membership. I absolutely agree that every HREC should have someone Indigenous on the committee, but I think it's a really important point to make. We got to get away from the idea that Indigenous person is somehow responsible for overseeing any research that happens to be Indigenous. The breadth element is that Indigenous person is part of the body whole, right? It's part of the group that assesses all research, okay? And yes, they bring a unique domain knowledge, and they bring a unique cultural experience, right? But, I think it's important for everything to be shared across the breadth of the whole committee, and I'd be fascinated about Mandy's thoughts on that.
No, thanks so much, Michael. And by the way, that you've answered question 7 now that I don't have to ask. And I will point out that Adrian Barnett, for those that may or may not know him, Adrian has been making a pitch for statisticians on ethics committees. And I think, Michael, it was, some of the pushback there is that, well, we don't do clinical trials or quantitative research, therefore we don't need it. But if I'm understanding you correctly, then you feel there's a place for that in most research.
Oh, absolutely. When we get even autoethnographic research, to a statistician, that's just n equals 1, right? We can think about these things in a statistical frame. That doesn't mean we're going to sit there and complain about sample size, right? But the experience that a statistician brings is nevertheless, I think, really useful, because a statistician's in a unique position to understand population dynamics. And even when N is very small and you're looking at unique experiences, these have to be fit within the broader human experience. And I think statisticians bring a perspective on that. And that's not to say we should be the only ones on the committee, because of course we shouldn't.
Michael, do you think a statistician would be better able to meet that perspective than, say, an epidemiologist?
Oh, no. A statistician is not necessarily a narrow profession. Anyone with statistical training, of course, is welcome, right? Epidemiologists, demographers, in my department, we might say, look, what's AI? Well, AI is just statisticians who do some computer science. If you go over to computer science, they say it's computer scientists who understand a bit of statistics. Yeah, we've entered this world where everybody's an expert on something, and we've gone away from the world of polymaths and polyglots. And you know what? It'd be nice if we could get back at least a little bit to poly anything.
I love being a polyglot, Michael.
I just don't want you being a Pollyanna, Gordon.
Just before I go hand over to Andrew, there's a difference between a statistician and, say, a clinical trial biostatistician, right? So let's not make any bones about the fact that, for certain studies, you require certain skills.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's it. Andrew, and anyone else. So, as Michael was pointing out, as it was reaffirming what Mandy's suggesting, the need to have an Indigenous person on the committee, potentially a biostatistician, potentially consumer representative is important. But to what extent do you feel that that committees can be reliant on a single voice that doesn't, doesn't have empirical evidence? It's not quite, I don't mean to be demeaning, it's not the vibe of the thing, but there can be a tendency to sort of walk on eggshells at times because, well, they're an Indigenous representative, they've given us their view, or they're an ethnic minority representative, they've given us their view, we can't not take it, discuss.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's one answer to that question, though it is a very interesting question, and a lot of what Michael has said about the role of epidemiologists and statisticians is very interesting. In fact, at WeHi, we do have an epidemiologist statistician on the committee because of the nature of the complexity of a lot of the genomic research and the data analysis, the secondary analysis and so on. It does help to have that voice there. Now, I don't think, though, that that's a necessary voice for all committees, because I have a view which might go against those who want to harmonise processes, and it's a voice that kind of comes from what Paul Commissarov actually talked about many years ago, the notion that human research ethics committees in various places, and in Australia it's an institutional system, so most except for Bellbury are within an institution, but they develop distinct cultures and they develop distinct skills because in response to the types of research that they're discussing. And so, while I agree that harmonising processes is a useful thing up to a certain threshold, we will never harmonise ethics because it is a differential process which occurs in response to people's connection to place or their connection to others, their relationships and so on. And that's why ethics committees are different. And that's why when you send one type of ethics application to 20 committees, you might even get 20 responses. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That could even be a very good thing because it's allowing that relational culture to be lived out in the decision-making process, the philosophical determinations of that group of people. Because they're not all the same doesn't mean it's wrong, because, as I say, the distinct nature of how a committee develops, like IATSIS, for instance, very, very different from WeHi. IATSIS has long-term deliberation. You spend a day at IATSIS to go through a few proposals, but it is a fantastic day. And what happens there is very different from what we do at the University of the Sunshine Coast, where it's bang, 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 perfect process. 2 hours, it's over. We can do 10 applications in 2 hours because all the work's done before, really. Very different committees, but making good decisions in very different ways. So that's just something I would like to say. And I think with the statistician, I think every committee, for you, Michael, I'd like to see you on every committee in the country. Not all statisticians are like you, and not all committees need a statistician.
So 2 points.
And maybe the peer review process can help out in that understanding of the research.
Peter Dunst's up there that obviously every member, irrespective of whether you are Indigenous, ethnic, community engagement member, if you're on a committee, you have a responsibility to comment on every application. It's not just about the ones that, so a very good point, Peter. And in that way, the diversity brings the best outcome. And Gary Ivory, and thank you, Gary, you've definitely been the biggest contributor of the last 3 days, has pointed out how, maybe I'll pose this say to Susie. Susie, how agile are committees then to get the people they require for when they need it? Do you think all ethics committees are sufficiently agile? Would you say your committee is agile enough, or based on the fact you think you don't adhere to the necessarily the national statement structure, your committee flows well anyway?
As a committee that has spent the last few months trying to get a second legal member, I echo a lot of the comments in the chat about how there's a shortage of everybody. Somebody said there's a shortage of statisticians. There's, it's hard to be agile even within the existing categories. And I think there's a risk that you end up with overusing the same people, that, our one lawyer hasn't been able to take leave because we need her for our quorum every month.
So just on that though, Susie, just on that, you need her for quorum, but is your one lawyer sufficiently capable of dealing with all of the, a lawyer isn't meant to give you legal advice, but they have a legal perspective. So how do you deal then, with all of the legislative requirements, such as privacy, that change? Do you expect that legal member to be on top of it, or do you expect all of your members to be on top of it?
We expect all of our members to engage in good faith as best they can with a reasonable expectation of, we don't expect people to be lawyers. The whole point is that we're an ethics committee, we're not lawyers. I think the national statement is, every time it's revised, it starts to sound more and more legalistic and gets longer and more detailed. And it does worry me that in parallel, the expectations of our legal expertise increases every time the national statement is revised. But I feel like all the members should be supported and trained to be able to make their best effort, rather than relying on the one legal member to be the fount of all legal knowledge, because they can't. And I think it's unrealistic to expect an ethics committee to do that legal function. We have legal people that we can send things to have a look at if we need that specialist legal review. But we don't expect our HREC members to do that.
Well, the national statement actually says, of course, that, or that Section 95 or Section 95A guidelines, in fact, around waivers of consent suggest that it's an ethics committee decision. The national statement at 5.1.17, I can't remember, also says that if you use a non-HREC level of review, that level of review has to be across privacy and any legislation relating to the application. So why is that not an ethics committee responsibility?
Good question.
Okay, so let's not pursue that one.
Well, it might be in the national statement, but it probably is. I mean, this is the thing. The national statement is conflicting, and we all know it's going back for review because of its conflicting nature. It's very prescriptive in parts, and it's non-prescriptive in others. It's guidelines. And ethics committees interpret those guidelines in different ways. Some committees are very reticent to do waivers at all. Some committees are conservative, some committees are not. Some committees are very flexible. It depends. So, it's an interesting
it's not
thing.
Black and white, Andrew.
Guidelines.
And you'll have heard both, I guess, from myself and from Rebecca McWhirter about the shared ethical decision-making exercise, which demonstrated, as you correctly point out, Andrew, that some are hesitant to give waivers, potentially because of a lack of knowledge or understanding of that. And by the way, Susie, I'm not having a go at you in any means. It just demonstrates the complexity of a committee where, as you say, you can't necessarily expect one legal member to know it all, but yet the national statement does impose certain responsibilities upon committees. Just changing tack slightly. So we heard from Greg Pratt, Mandy, I'm not sure if you were on then, about the establishment, or at least doing the scoping study for a Queensland Aboriginal and Islander ethics committee. What do you think are the limitations of such a group? And I ask that because my former ethics committee, University of Queensland, we would get from time to time Indigenous research, some of which undoubtedly required expert view, others of which didn't. So perhaps you can contrast this with IATSIS and potentially any of the other Aboriginal HRECs about the scope of their involvement in review and what you might expect from, say, the Queensland Aboriginal Ethics Committee to achieve.
I don't know that I should be speaking on behalf of them by any means, or
Oh no, I don't expect you to. I'm just curious in your view.
but first and foremost, we have very intelligent and qualified people around the country, so there is a great degree of expertise. What we don't have is a lot of time, and a lot of the things that we're tasked to do by way of joining an ethics committee, and we all know the work, the volume of reading, and comparing the application to what's in the national statement to what's in the code, and everyone else's governance for wherever it's going. If it's I'm a humanities person, so if it's education based, if it's hospital based, all those things, it's such a lot of work. So if you're trying to pin down Aboriginal people, particularly leaders in community, to have ample time to do that work consistently, you're always going to run into challenges. I certainly hope they've got funding to pay people appropriately for their time and their expertise, because that's something I'm always concerned about with our people. But largely, the biggest challenge is time. There's being 3% of the national population, we're really stretched in what we do already. And those of us who are sort of working in this space, or I'd imagine in health backgrounds, certainly if I speak on my own behalf, you end up on every committee and board and whatever else under the sun. And I mean, I'm counting down the days for the festive season break for the university where I can sleep. I'm really looking forward to that. And I don't think I'm alone in that as an Aboriginal person. So I think that's going to be the biggest challenge there, is finding people who have sufficient time to be able to do all that work, and for very little return on investment, other than we care about what happens to our people, what happens to our community, what happens to our data, our stories, how we're represented in research findings, and the impacts to our community. There is great benefit from research, and we do have a lot of concerns about how it's carried out and what the impact of it is, but it is a lot of work. And I hope they've got some enthusiastic people with a lot of time. That's all I can suggest, is time is the biggest factor for us. It's not through lack of wanting to be involved or doing the work. It's just there are so many spot fires that we have to spend time putting out that we can't step back and look at the bigger picture of what is creating all these spot fires. So,
and to extend that metaphor, burnout is one of the biggest problems.
No, thank you, Hudson. I mean, I speak from my experience just on the University of Queensland Ethics Committee, and the fact that they really struggle to find academics to be able to have time to provide advice, let alone review anything. So, that's it's a large university, but it wouldn't be the same. I mean, Charles Darwin Unis had to approach it in a different, using a different mechanism, of course, and for them it would probably be successful. But I take your point, Mandy. Thanks for thanks for raising that. Michael, I might just ask you, as a sort of former chair of ANU, and how your committee dealt with how you managed to get the appropriate advice for. Did you struggle, as Mandy's pointed out, to get input where you required it for such applications?
Absolutely. Look, what Mandy says is absolutely spot on. We have a large number, relatively speaking, of Indigenous academics, but every single one of them is on every committee you can imagine around the university. So time poor is not a good enough phrase to cover what's going on here, right? It's exploitation. But it's exploitation that is somehow cast as inclusion. And that's where we have to be really careful, because at the end of the day, including people because you feel you have a societal responsibility to do so, but thereby exploiting them is the opposite of what we ought to be doing, right? So we tried to set up a structure where we had an Indigenous advisory group to support and to review Indigenous research on campus. That worked really well for a little while, but eventually it just became a time sink for the 2 or 3 people who could be involved. And so we've hit capacity limits. And, look, we're really lucky. You can walk from the ANU down to the IATSIS building. And so, someone raised this sort of fantastical notion that, we could just send all of our Indigenous protocols down to IATSIS. And, I can see Mandy's immediate reaction there. Well, to me, it's saying, well, the ANU suddenly is shirking the responsibility that it has to review this sort of research. But, this is the sign that we are in a very limited resource setting. And look, let's be absolutely clear. Why do universities have HRECs? Because they have to, right? Every time a call goes out for people to be on an HREC, right, you can see people running away from you, right? And these are the same people who apparently have endless time to spend arguing with you if their research is under the scope, right? They'll send you 400 emails, and at the same time, as soon as you send them an email saying, "Why don't you be on an ethics committee?" No, silence, right? Crickets. And so, I think we have to rethink at universities what the role of service is, and I think we have to reward it. There's a rich tradition at universities that you get rewarded for highly selfish activities, and you don't get rewarded for activities that actually advance the institution. And I think in promotions proceedings, we ask entirely the wrong question. We ask, how good are you, instead of what value do you bring? And I think we need to start turning this around. And until we do, ethics committees at universities are going to be the basket case that they presently are. And that's deeply problematic, because we don't think about this as affecting the researchers. We think about this as affecting institutional processes. But as soon as the ethics processes break down, the research gets, and I'm going to use a technical term here, crappier.
Well said,
Michael. Looking just to support that in any review of ethics committees that I do, or universities, it is very clear that service is not valued. Being on an ethics committee is not valued as service, and it does go back to your point of exploitation. Now, far be it for me to say that, but I guess it does raise its head about why anyone would be on an ethics committee if they are not being recognised for that. Now, Tracy Powis has just asked a great question, which was, do we need to look at the fluency of HRECs in cultural reflexivity and competency against Indigenous standard of ethics? Would that lift the bar of cultural competence so that the demand is lowered? Anyone wish to take that on?
Well, I'll just say one thing. Everybody on ethics committees should have a good read of the IATSIS guide, the IATSIS code, because a lot of stuff in there is apparently unknown to researchers, right? Particularly around the question of what is Indigenous research.
Yeah.
And Mandy's just held it up.
You must also note that Tracy's on IATSIS as well. She's there you
go. It's a bit of a cabal here, isn't it? Looking like
you're being baited, Gordon.
Okay, well let's change tack here. Andrew Crowden, do we need Hudson Burden? Do we need 200 ethics committees in Australia?
Well, probably not, since that's more ethics committees per capita or per whatever than anybody else has. But if you can ask the follow-up question, how do we winnow it down to a better number, and what is a better number? I don't have answers to those.
Yeah, I tend to think a mixed model of things works well. Like, it's institutional, as I said before, and those institutional committees build their own culture, and they're very different. But there's also independent committees like Bellbury, which does a lot of good work, in the clinical trial space and elsewhere now, I think. And they kind of do external, I guess they build the culture of Bellbury, and they build their own culture of independent review. But it's a multi-level model, and it's a bit like the Indigenous thing too. We do need specialist Indigenous committees for the highly targeted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, but most committees should be able to approve either the non-targeted research, and even, as Colin Thompson used to say, research that's on the shoulder, research that involves Indigenous people but isn't kind of targeting them in a high-risk way. So most committees should be able to do that. So it's a multi-level kind of system we need. So do we need 200? Yeah, I think we do.
It's interesting, Andrew, and you just made me think of what I was thinking of earlier, which is, if we think of AI and anything else, like, you take out the technical bits of it, then it comes down to the ethics, and in actual fact, all ethics committees should be able to deal with justice, beneficence, respect, get some assistance with merit and integrity, definitely have some input into Indigenous research, etc. But most ethics committees can do the core of all research.
They can, but there's a confounding factor, and that's the people and the researchers and the participants and the institutions that get in the way of that. Someone mentioned Socrates yesterday. Well, I'll mention Aristotle. Aristotle said all ethics was actually politics. And it kind of, when you think about, those dimensions of moral philosophy that we all engage in on our ethics committees, that's the separate culture that's coming out. And it is very difficult to apply something like, as you say, research merit and integrity in a universal way across all of Australia, let alone across the world. And of course, we're approving a lot of research that's being done in other countries with other groups of Indigenous people with very different needs and understandings and so on. So for me, I think we need more rather than less to do that job, because in the end, it's about what is right, what is good. It's about, what do the Wurundjeri say, Yinda Jamara. It's about deep respect, deep listening. That's what ethics is about. The formal committee process, well, that's a tool. That's like the hammer. The people are what matters, and the decisions we make, the conversations we have, and so on. Yeah.
It's a great point, Andrew, because when the NHMRC set up their accreditation scheme, what they did was they certified the ethical review processes. They didn't certify the deliberations and discussion of the committee, thereby, I think, delineating or differentiating between the two aspects.
Didn't even take those into consideration.
And that's really important, Gordon. And that's, in fact, I was on that, going around, accrediting committees.
As was I, Andrew.
And that was really significant point you just made, because that's what we can get more in line is the guidelines and the processes, but not the deliberations. That's an amazing point. Sorry.
Right, Hudson. Hudson, did you have a comment there?
Yep, but it's been and gone. Although I'll add one other comment, Andrew. When I was teaching ethics formally, I started every semester saying all ethics is situational ethics.
Susie, so just thinking about that comment about whether we need 200 ethics committees, it's useful sometimes just to differentiate between the committees. So yourself and Hudson, for example, run NMA certified hospital committees. Michael was chair of ANU. Andrew is the WEHI, a medical research institute. And Andrew, by the way, I totally agree. I think MRIs do have a confined amount of ethics that they have to do and can very easily sort of I reckon you could pretty easily become a bit reductionist, actually, in that sort of environment, just because of the...
But there's a lot of overseas research. That's where it gets challenging when you've got a clinical trial in Malawi and you're collecting samples from 20 other countries, doing genomic analysis in a lab at WEHI in Melbourne, NARM, and there's an Aboriginal group that we're going to put in there as well. So it gets tricky.
Okay, well, it's good to see there's a breadth there, because I think if it was very narrow, it could become quite reductionist. And as we've talked about over the conference, if you have too many checklists and too much prescriptive guidance, then, it stops you thinking, really. Now, Susie, as the chair of the Royal Prince Alfred HREC, what is your sort of volume, and, what point do you say, like, enough's enough? Do you actually say, well, you know what, we actually need another committee? I guess you've got Concord as well, haven't you?
We have. And we, as the chat is just discussing, we have a clinical trials scientific subcommittee that kind of does all the statistics and medical and pharmacy review before the things come to the HREC, so that we can focus on just the ethical concerns rather than the sample size and all the stuff that we've just mentioned with biostatistician. And we have a separate other subcommittee for clinical practice questions, so that the HREC can just focus on the research applications. And yes, I think we've already separated them into separate committees.
So I just wanted to just take it a bit further, because I know one medical research institute that has a clinical trials protocol committee and the scientific subcommittee. Now, Clinical Trials Protocol Committee makes perfect sense, doesn't meet ICH, GCP, E6R3, hasn't dealt with toxicology, pharmacology, stopping rules, etc. That's not in the bailiwick of the Ethics Committee. But, you know, the science is, and you have category F members, particularly as those researchers who have an understanding of the research that's taking place. So here's a view. I don't believe you need a scientific subcommittee. I think you need a clinical trial protocol committee, but any scientific subcommittee should be helping to upskill the members of the committee to understand things. What do you reckon?
Oh, no, I completely agree. Our clinical trials subcommittee only take the things that are actually clinical trials. And there are plenty of sciencey research being done that are not categorized as clinical trials. And so they don't go to that subcommittee, they come to us. And so, yes, it's important that our clinician members and our independent reviewers that we can send off and consult with if there's some really niche sciencey things in the research, it's important that we have those resources for our committee discussions, because without them we would be floundering.
Yeah.
And I can see the ever sagacious Michael Martin has effectively agreed with what I said. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. You knew you weren't going to get a look in. Andrew, did you have a comment on this?
I think it's a really good point, Gordon. I've been in several institutions chairing the committee where we had scientific subcommittees. Now they don't have them because it was the more committees you have within one institution, the slower the process. And it's kind of was working a bit like a peer review process with scientists giving their views about whether this is good science or not to other scientists, and it caused a lot of tension. So I'm of the opinion that 1.1 of the national statement can be met primarily by a Human Research Ethics Committee, providing there's some sort of peer review process whereby at least one other scientist indicates that this research is consistent with the processes within this and understandings within this discipline. I think that's kind of all you need, unless the scientists and researchers want that sort of rigorous committee review before it goes to an HREC. But generally, I find they don't, because they want to do research. They don't want to be filling out forms for committees. So in that sense, I go against what I said before when I said we could do with more HRECs. I think we need less committees in
less subcommittees, yeah.
So I agree with you, Gordon.
Thank goodness for that. No, thanks, Andrew. I think it's important that ethics committees understand that at a minimum, the methodology will answer the research question, and so therefore it is consistent with good research practice. Now, Mandy, national statement and changes 2025. Now we all know it's not going to come until January. Personally, I really like the national statement. I find I commend it on every possible occasion. How have you engaged with it? How has IATSIS engaged with it, and has it made any big differences for yourself?
Well, I didn't chair the last meeting. My co-conspirator Trent Shepherd did, so not entirely sure.
We engaged in the development, though, Mandy. We engaged in the development of it with 4.7.
Yeah, we did. Well, I mean, some of our feedback got updated, some of it didn't. I think it's fair to say.
Isn't that always the way?
So, I mean, for IATSIS, we're a fee-for-service committee. So if people are applying to us for an ethics approval, we're going to review it at a full committee level. There's no other review pathways at this stage. So there's not much difference for us. It really is just, I think, updating our forms and being conscious of the different references now instead of the ones we would normally espouse in our feedback letters. I don't feel that there's a huge amount of change from an IATSIS perspective because we're already Indigenous people largely reviewing research, Indigenous research. But can I be really cheeky and come back to the conversation before around
Stephen, you can't share your screen right now. Well, you can. I'd rather you didn't. Just carry on.
Yeah. regarding the number of committees, how many do we need? I'm less concerned with the numbers. Maybe this is about being a qualitative person, but more concerned about the experience as a researcher trying to get an approval in the first place. Because as Gordon, you said before about, you know, the other process we had didn't really work in that even though they were registered committees, there are still plenty of committees who would not accept approvals from particular registered committees.
Yeah.
So I am concerned about how we go forward if we can streamline processes where I think there's almost a sense of can we all play well with others and accept each other's reviews, or what would it take for that to happen? Obviously, that registration process was not enough. I think of that Indigenous eye health study where it took 18 months for someone to get an ethics approval for one project. And I, you know, by way of meeting funding requirements, milestones, if a student is attached to that, what then happens to their project? 18 months is absolutely ridiculous. So I think I'm less concerned about the number of committees and more about how do we work together to find ways to streamline process as committees going forward to benefit researchers and research in general, because I'm not a fan of too much bureaucracy. I think there is overkill. My first thesis was looking at institutional barriers to Aboriginal research.
We love our research governance officers, Mandy. Let's make no bones about it.
Yeah, but it's just there's sort of stops of IATSs, like I said, we do not have a reciprocal review process as a fee-for-service committee. Hospitals obviously don't accept university approvals. Aboriginal health committees won't accept university approvals. So there's sort of all these different parts that don't really fit together in this puzzle, and I think we do need to reflect on that collectively.
It's a great point. And this morning, Michael Swarbrick from the Department of Health and Ageing, formerly the Safety and Quality Commission, was talking about the accreditation standards for HRECs. And Andrew, I'll just go back to the fact that you know, potentially we could have 3 or 4 tiers of ethics committees depending on what happens. I'm all for streamlining, but I think you would all agree not at the expense of agility and, you know, ability to deal in that philosophical manner, as Andrew has pointed out, with whatever comes our way. So I think quality is important, and maybe that's what I'm going to do now. We've actually got about 3 minutes left. So what I might do is, to you all, I will pose the following question. What are the things that can happen in our sector most to either improve quality or give us the biggest, you know, efficiency bang for a buck? And Mandy, since you're on my screen, you can start with that one.
For HRECs in general?
Yep. HREC and I guess the HREC ecosystem.
Okay, from my perspective, I want HREC members to actually get out in community and engage with our people. I don't want this just to be pushed on to researchers as applicants needing to prove that they've engaged. I want HREC members to have a better understanding of Indigenous priorities and what we need. So if that means going out into community and having conversations, improving cultural capability, engaging in Indigenous media source. I mean, AI is so problematic. There is so much misinformation about us. So I think that's what I would like to see from my positionality is HREC members in general, get out and engage with our communities.
That's awesome. I've never heard that before, actually. So that's provocative, most definitely. But yeah, first time I've heard that one.
I agree with that. And I also think researchers need to get out there and engage. Read the IATSIS code if you're thinking of doing research with Indigenous people, and think about real connection and engagement, and extend that to non-Indigenous research as well. Read the national statement. This is for researchers. That's 2 things they can do that would help matters a lot more. And I also think that when we think of ethics and research integrity and so on, the claim for how we, the concern about how we manage research misconduct at the hard end of things probably needs more discussion. And I think the argument by people like Ian Freckleton and others for having an Office of Research Integrity.
You mean Ian Chubb? Hopefully you mean Ian Chubb.
Yeah. Well, that kind of is something that we need to seriously think about, and that'll go. And the other thing is resourcing. Institutions, for an institutional model of research ethics review, are not funded or remunerated enough, and there needs to be proper funding and resourcing to the institutions, the communities who are having to manage ethics committees. You have to have an ethics committee, as Michael said earlier.
Cost of doing business, Andrew.
It should be resourced properly, because people are working way too hard, working weekends, long hours. It's a tough thing to do, to review applications. It needs to be properly supported.
Thank you for that. Hudson.
My biggest concern is lack of transparency and lack of visibility of decisions made by committees. We've had several examples where we've had, I can think of one application that if the project went ahead would have provided serious harm to First Nations people. We rejected it. It violated so many aspects of the national statement, or was in opposition to them. And these applicants just went elsewhere and got an approval and went ahead and did their project. Our ethics application has a tick box that you have to tick saying, have you been approved by any other ethics committee? It doesn't have a tick box saying, have you been denied approval by any other ethics committee? This is my biggest concern in our realm.
Well done for leading that, Hudson, too. That was excellent. And it was discussed, in many places, that incident case you're talking about. Well done.
Thank you, thanks, Hudson. So,
thanks, Andrew.
To all online, no committee shopping, please. Just fess up and suggest that your application wasn't good enough to be approved at one ethics committee. Susie.
I think I would like to echo what Hudson said. I think when we look at the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct in research, there's the principles. I think they apply to the conduct of ethics committees as well. Honesty, rigour, transparency.
Yeah, great point. Great point.
Accountability. I think they provide us with the principles that we need. And I don't know. I think that the perception in the research community that the ethics committee is like a faceless bunch of dudes in a bunker somewhere telling them they can't do their research and swooping down punitively if they do something wrong. That view comes from not knowing who's on the committee, not having any kind of transparent sense of what the procedures are and what principles we're basing our decisions on. And the more transparency and accountability, the better. It would do nothing but improve the relationship that we have with researchers and what they think we do.
Yeah, and Susie, I will absolutely support that and say that all ethics committees, chair people should be available to interact with researchers. We cannot hide behind anonymity. It's not fair, and otherwise we have to rely on comments from the ethics office, which, although talented, are not the same as those coming from the chairperson. So I would echo your comments ideally. And as Jeremy points out, Susie, do you feel like a faceless dude? I think you meant Susie, by the way, Jeremy, not Mandy. Anyhow, Michael Martin, who is, okay, he's estimable, he's quantifiable. Michael, you've got the last word on this today.
And sagacious, if I understand the other large word you used about me.
An old white bloke as well.
Yeah, that's it. I've got it all. Yeah, look, I'd say only this. I think one thing that would change our practice inestimably would be for everyone to understand that ethics review is not an antagonistic or competitive process, right? We're all in the same business, but we act as if we're on different teams. And the problem is that researchers view us as the enemy. And of course, we view researchers in some ways as the enemy because they argue with us. And, so I think we all have to stop being a little bit less precious around how smart each of us individually might be, and actually talk to each other. And this means talking between committees. So, for example, in the case of Mandy's example of 18 months to get an approval. Well, what I would have done in that instance is I would have said to the researcher, right, if you need approval from a particular Aboriginal Health Ethics Committee, go there first. When you come back with their approval, we'll approve it, right? Even if we don't have a formal relationship with that committee. And if I see a problem with it, I'll get on the phone. right? And I'll talk with the chair and we'll sort it out. We can sort all sorts of things out if we talk. And I think the spirit of that has been lost in the administrative mayhem that our structures seem to cause. So yeah, we're not the enemy. We should be friends. And if we can do that, we're winning.
Awesome. So look, it's 3:19, only 4 minutes over time. Clearly, we could have actually just had a whole morning of chatting to you, to all of you wise individuals there. I do want to thank you for your inputs. We still got a fair number of people online, so thank you, Andrew, Mandy, Michael, Susie, and Hudson for your thoughts. We only got halfway through the questions, but that is par for the course, and it just demonstrates that some of these things require discussion, and probably require more discussion than we were able to give it. So all of you,
thank you, Gordon, for organising this awesome conference.
Yes, indeed.
My pleasure, and thank you to the organising committee also, and with the assistance of Health Translation Queensland for doing the logistics and administration. Righto, when we move to the last